The seeds of conflict. Early U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The United States first became entangled in Vietnam's affairs in the early 1950s, a time when the world was gripped by the Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. The country was then divided, with communist forces controlling the north and a US-backed government in the south. This division was a result of the Geneva Accords, which temporarily separated Vietnam at the 17th parallel, intending to hold elections to unify the country. Initially, the US provided financial aid and military advisors to support the French, who were fighting to maintain their colonial hold on Vietnam. The US saw this as a crucial front in the battle against the spread of communism in Asia. However, after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the US took a more active role. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was a significant turning point, leading to the withdrawal of French forces and the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. President Eisenhower, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, pledged support to the newly established Republic of Vietnam in the South. This policy was driven by the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. This marked the beginning of a long and costly American commitment to preventing the communist North from unifying the country. The US began to send more military advisors and resources to support the South Vietnamese government. The US poured resources into South Vietnam, providing economic assistance and military training to bolster the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was seen as a strong anti-communist leader, but his methods and policies were often controversial. However, Diem's regime was plagued by corruption and inefficiency, fueling resentment among the population. His oppressive policies, particularly against Buddhists, led to widespread protests and civil unrest. By the early 1960s, the communist insurgency in the South, known as the Viet Cong, was gaining strength. The Viet Cong, supported by North Vietnam, began to launch more frequent and deadly attacks against the South Vietnamese government and its supporters. The U.S., under President Kennedy, faced a critical decision: escalate American involvement, or risk the fall of South Vietnam to communism. Kennedy increased the number of military advisors and aid, but the situation continued to deteriorate, setting the stage for deeper American involvement in the years to come. The escalation, from advisors to combat troops. The assassination of President Diem in 1963 created a power vacuum in South Vietnam, leading to increased instability and chaos within the government. This turmoil further emboldened the Viet Cong, who intensified their guerrilla tactics and expanded their influence in the countryside. President Kennedy, though hesitant to commit large-scale ground troops, increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam. These advisors were tasked with training South Vietnamese forces and providing strategic support. The situation escalated dramatically in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which marked a significant turning point in U.S. involvement. U.S. destroyers reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, an event that was highly controversial and debated back home. This incident prompted Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which effectively gave the president a blank check to use military force in Vietnam. This resolution granted President Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war, significantly changing the U.S.'s role in the conflict. Following the incident, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam aimed at crippling their infrastructure and war capabilities. By 1965, U.S. combat troops were deployed to Vietnam, marking a significant escalation and a turning point in the conflict. This deployment signaled the shift from advisory roles to active combat operations. The number of American soldiers in Vietnam steadily increased over the next few years, with more and more troops being sent to support the war effort. The U.S. strategy focused on a war of attrition, aiming to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy and wear down their will to fight. This approach led to numerous intense battles and significant loss of life on both sides. As the war dragged on, U.S. soldiers found themselves not only fighting the Viet Cong, but also trying to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, a challenging task in the midst of ongoing conflict. Back in the United States, the increasing involvement in Vietnam sparked widespread protests and a growing anti-war movement, reflecting the nation's deepening divisions over the conflict. The battleground key engagements and operations. The Vietnam War was characterized by a brutal combination of guerrilla warfare and conventional battles. The conflict saw a relentless struggle between the North Vietnamese forces, including the Viet Cong, and the US-backed South Vietnamese army. Each side employed different tactics, making the war unpredictable and deadly. The Viet Cong, highly skilled in jungle warfare, often blended in with the civilian population, making it difficult for US forces to distinguish between friend and foe. This tactic not only provided them with cover, but also allowed them to launch surprise attacks, creating a constant state of tension and uncertainty for US troops. One of the first major battles involving US troops was the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in 1965. This battle marked the first large-scale helicopter air assault and set the stage for future airmobile operations. The intense combat demonstrated the effectiveness and limitations of air mobility in the dense Vietnamese terrain. The battle, a fierce encounter between US airmobile forces and North Vietnamese regulars, highlighted the challenges and ferocity of the fighting in Vietnam. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and the battle underscored the determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese forces. Other significant engagements included the Battle of Dak Tu in 1967, a prolonged and bloody battle in the Central Highlands. This battle was marked by intense close-quarters combat and significant losses on both sides, further illustrating the brutal nature of the conflict. And the Battle of Hue, during the Tet Offensive in 1968, a brutal urban fight that resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war, as it demonstrated the Viet Cong's ability to launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, challenging the perception of US military superiority. The US military also conducted large-scale search and destroy missions, aiming to root out Viet Cong sanctuaries and disrupt their supply lines. These operations involved sweeping through villages and jungles, often leading to intense firefights and the destruction of enemy resources. However, these operations often resulted in widespread destruction and civilian casualties, alienating the local population and fueling anti-war sentiment. The collateral damage and loss of innocent lives contributed to growing opposition to the war, both in Vietnam and back home in the United States, ultimately influencing the course of the conflict. The Tet Offensive, a turning point in the war. The Tet Offensive in 1968 marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. In a surprise offensive, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on major cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, including Saigon. Although the offensive was militarily defeated, it had a profound impact on American public opinion. The Tet Offensive shattered the perception that the US was winning the war and exposed the resilience and determination of the communist forces. The graphic images of fighting in the streets of Saigon, broadcast into American homes on television, fueled growing anti-war sentiment and eroded public support for the Johnson administration's handling of the conflict. The Tet Offensive also exposed the credibility gap between the Johnson administration's optimistic assessments of the war and the reality on the ground. The public increasingly questioned the war's objectives and the human cost of the conflict. Section 5. The Homefront Anti-War Movement and Public Opinion. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition to the conflict grew steadily within the United States. The anti-war movement, fueled by a combination of moral outrage, fear of the draft, and disillusionment with the government, gained momentum throughout the late 1960s. College campuses became centers of anti-war activism, with students organizing protests, teach-ins, and draft resistance movements. The movement attracted a diverse range of participants, including students, civil rights activists, clergy members, and veterans of the war itself. The anti-war movement was amplified by growing media coverage of the conflict, which brought the brutality of war into American living rooms. Images of casualties, refugees, and the use of napalm and Agent Orange shocked the nation's conscience and fueled public debate about the morality of the war. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, who had become a vocal critic of the war, further galvanized the anti-war movement and deepened divisions within American society. Section 6. The Withdrawal Negotiations and the Fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on the United States, It reshaped American politics, society, and foreign policy. The war sparked widespread protests and led to a deep division within the country. Veterans returned home to a nation struggling to understand and heal from the conflict. The experience of Vietnam influenced how America would approach future military engagements, emphasizing the need for clear objectives and public support. Vietnam, too, was transformed by the war. The conflict brought immense suffering and devastation, but it also led to a reunified country under communist rule. The resilience and determination of the Vietnamese people were evident as they rebuilt their nation from the ruins of war. The legacy of the conflict continues to shape Vietnam's identity and its place in the world today. The Vietnam War offers many lessons and reflections for future generations. It reminds us of the complexities of international conflict and the profound impact it can have on nations and individuals. Understanding the history of the Vietnam War helps us appreciate the importance of diplomacy, the cost of war, and the enduring human spirit in the face of adversity.